Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, and heritage professionals about history, games, and the places where they meet. I'm Eduard Gafton, and before we properly start, I need to tell you that this is a video podcast. And so if you're a watcher on YouTube, welcome. This is a premiere recording for us. So in that sense, also apologies for any quality of production issues. I fully expect the quality to go up from here as we get used to doing this more often. This being said, in this episode, I am pleased to be joined by my co-moderator and History and Games Lab colleague Hannah Weaver and by podcast guests Erika Svanoe and Erika Evensen. Erika is the conductor of the Augsburg Concert Band of Augsburg University in Minnesota in the United States. She's a freelance composer, conductor, and clinician, and most importantly for us, she's the creator of Marrying Mr. Darcy, the Pride and Prejudice card game that is the topic for today's show. As for Erik, he is a designer, educator, graphic novelist on Gods of Asgard and the Beast of Wolf's Bay, and the illustrator for Marrying Mr. Darcy. Erik and Erika live together as husband and wife near Minnesota in the United States. Welcome to the show, everyone. How is everyone today? How are you feeling?
Doing great. It's a beautiful day here where we are in the US, so it's
in the morning.
In the morning. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. Hannah, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. The sun's shining here as well, so yeah, a great day so far. Great. So, for listeners unfamiliar with the game, Marrying Mr. Darcy is a strategy-based card game centered around the characters of the fabulous book Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Designed for 2 to 6 players, you assume the role of one of the female characters from the book to secure a perfect marriage proposal. Along the way, characters build their accomplishments of wit, beauty, reputation, and friendliness to attract their suitors while attending events and using their cunning cards to strategize. Marriages in the game are made with a combination of luck from the roll of a dice and by possessing a specific combination of character cards for each suitor. The winner is the player with the highest combined total of accomplishment points and points from their chosen suitor. So let's start some discussion about the making of Marrying Mr. Darcy. I'm so interested in knowing, how did the idea for the game Marrying Mr. Darcy start?
Well, I was teaching, and I had just wrapped up my academic school year. So it was maybe April or May, and everything was sort of wrapping up school-wise. And usually around about this time of year, my brain starts sort of thinking about what am I going to do over the summer? And so I was really excited to work on some creative sort of project. And a web series at that time called The Lizzie Bennet Diaries had just released and started this amazing adaptation where they took Pride and Prejudice and changed it to this sort of web blog drama sort of adaptation. And I just thought it was the most clever thing, and I'm a huge fan of it. And it got me thinking, I am also a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice. I have watched the BBC adaptation. I can't even tell you how many times. Like, there was a period of time where I watched that thing once a week. It's pretty long, so that's a significant amount of time that I spent watching it. And I thought, I want to make my own thing. I don't know what this is. And Erik, in his master's degree, which he had finished a few years prior, did a master's on related to game design.
Yeah, design research and board game design.
Right. And as good spouses, we proofread each other's theses. And so I read it, and so I had like a little bit of an idea of the process of game design, and I think that was sort of in my head. So I also thought the world that Jane Austen had sort of reflected or created, or however you want to think about it, I thought was already gamified, like the sort of things that she put into the novel about scheming mamas and like how strategic everything you wear is, like all of these things that are part of that world. And it seemed like it was already built for being a game. And so that's yeah. And then I ran to the store and bought like $20 worth of note cards. And I just started scribbling on my note cards and making cards and like trying things. And that's how it got started.
About what you just mentioned about kind of how it came to be with these note cards, what was it in particular that drew you to the format of cards as kind of the way this game was going to be played?
Yeah, I started with note cards. I think maybe it was because we had been playing a lot of games
Oh yeah.
that were similar to that. Like I think we had recently been playing a lot of Munchkin, and I thought that the interaction with cards in that game, I think I had a little bit of that sort of mechanical process in my head of sort of with Munchkin, you kind of same sort of process. You're building a character, you're building your powers by laying out cards in front of you. But interestingly enough, when the game started its development, I had a lot more pieces.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had kind of fallen into the tabletop gaming movement a little bit in graduate school too. So I think for a few years we were very casual participants because we didn't have money. But we found that was a cheap way to like keep playing and hanging out with friends and stuff. So I think that was part of it too. But yeah, it kind of started off with a lot more in the way of components and pieces. And it definitely got streamlined the more the production guy, was talking about, well, this is going to cost money to print, or if we have like a player mat that's this big, that's going to be like, so many dollars per unit or whatever. So part of it got whittled down into just cards, just for production purposes, for ease of production. But
cards were always involved.
Yeah.
And I think there's also something about there's so many places in Jane Austen's novels where they are playing cards. Like that's a part of the fiction. And so I think it sort of was always there as part of that. But then Erik saying, all of these, there was like a economic
coins,
system.
yeah.
There were coins. There was a whole like player mat with like little sliders. And at some point, Erik said, I think it should just be cards. I think you should redesign it so it's just cards. And that was really a turning point. That was maybe 8 or 9 months into the process that we had gotten to that point to just do cards. And I think the game's a lot better for it, and is also a lot cheaper to print.
And buy.
That's so interesting. You talked about how there were kind of coins involved. Would you mind talking a bit more about that? Because you do mention dowries in the game, and I wondered if it was related to that.
Yeah, I think
that is how that came in.
That is how that came in. There was like a little
and allowances too.
And allowances. There were like, and I can't remember how you could spend your money. Like that's so long ago now, but there were definitely allowances, and you had a purse. And so, as in the books, like money is really crucial to how you might make a match that is either appropriate, or in the case of Elizabeth, like maybe not so appropriate, like to your economic status in the world. So that was definitely a big part of it. And then I think I whittled that down to just the one dowry indicator that gives you some advantages. And I think that helped sort of simplify things. Part of this, what I wanted this game to be, was I wanted it to be playable by people who had never read the book before. And so you don't need to know anything about Jane Austen or Pride and Prejudice to play the game. So there were definitely some things that got simplified from that, so that you could participate as a fan, or you could participate as like maybe a novice, or like your spouse is like, I need somebody to play with. So so there's a little bit of that too. So I think sort of simplifying the mechanics was part of the process. So a lot of that allowance and dowry got sort of simplified down into one sort of numeric factor.
That's so interesting that you talk about how the game you can play it no matter what your level of knowledge is around Jane Austen. But when you were thinking about the narrative, how much did you find you were having to adapt the narrative of the story to fit the game?
I feel like I built the mechanics from the book and from, or maybe not. Yeah, I think that's true. I think I really tried to reflect my interpretation of how these marriage matches were sort of made, and a lot of the gameplay is sort of built from that. So I feel like it's a reflection of the book and the sort of the society that Jane Austen is describing. So the idea that these women have really limited power. You know, they have limited power, and that's kind of the point of the game, is that they really needed to get married to secure their economic well-being. This was the one tool they had at their disposal, and really the only power that these women had, besides like trying to dress well and be friendly
and
and
piano, really, or piano,
learn the piano forte, become accomplished, develop their reputation, not have any scandals. They had that power. So those sort of manipulations felt very true to the world to me. But the other power that they had was the power to say no. And that is central to Jane Austen's work, I think, is giving that our heroines, they have the power to say, no, I don't want to marry you. And that's the one thing that they can really control, despite really huge pressure. When you think about it, Elizabeth Bennet saying no to her cousin, Mr. Collins, that's kind of crazy. I mean, that would have secured the financial well-being of her family indefinitely. And the fact that that she said no, I mean, that it's and then of course it all turns out beautifully in the end in the book, which is why I think maybe why so many, we love it still. But that power of saying no is what a woman could feasibly control, at least in Jane Austen's world.
Yeah, there definitely is this tension between kind of a love match, the concept of a love match, and socially acceptable marriages in Austen's books. And I wondered, what kind of gameplay mechanics did you introduce to try and highlight that tension in the game?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There's a really great book. There were so many things in the process that were like little bits here and little bits here. And partway through the process, I read a book called Jane Austen Game Theory, which is this really cool, like sort of like academic book on game theory, but using the world of Jane Austen to sort of explain it. And it was a really fascinating read. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, it really clarified some of my thinking. And then some of the other things that I did were partly just my own headcanon. So the idea of a socially acceptable match versus a love match. So I definitely made a spreadsheet.
More than one.
More than one spreadsheet that was really just documenting my own headcanon of how happy I thought the different women would be with different matches. And sometimes that happiness had to do with how much money they had and how secure they were. And sometimes it had to do with how in love they might be with this particular character. There were also decisions that had to be made to mathematically balance things out. I think like Lydia has, like Mr. Wickham and Lydia is really high points. And we know that probably that would, that's a disaster, obviously, regardless of what you do.
But at least the first few weeks probably.
The first initially is a very like happy match for Lydia, and that she's really enthusiastic about it. So Yeah, so there was definitely this spreadsheet of headcanon that like turned all of that into mathematical numbers, and I lots of wiggling things around. You know, somebody like Charlotte does well with a lot of people. She's just very content to be with, you know, whoever, as long as she's economically satisfied with her, you know, and secure. That's kind of what she cared about. And then somebody like Elizabeth has a much wider spread where, you know, ultimately she's the happiest with Mr. Darcy, and but it's there are less options for her, and sort of mathematically balancing all that out.
Even this idea of spreadsheets almost sounds like it's fan fiction territory of like imagining, thinking like alternative scenarios, and it's lovely that you've incorporated this idea in.
Yeah, well, the whole, you know, part of what I was interested in doing when the school year was ending and I wanted to create something, one of the ideas I had was maybe I should write some fan fiction. And so that idea of alternative narrative is definitely part of what I think makes this game really fun. So occasionally I'll get a tweet from somebody that tells me how their game went for their character. You know, I played as Lydia and ended up marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. And, you know, I screwed over Jane by, you know, taking Mr. Bingley away. And they'll give me this whole narrative of what their experience was. And so I think this sort of walks a little bit of a line. You know, this is a light strategy game, but I also like to think of it as a little bit of a light RPG as well, even though so the deck of events that happens in the game is a little bit randomized, but it is telling the story of the book in a sort of randomized way. So it's kind of, I feel like it's a little bit light RPG as well. And I think it's more fun if you wear bonnets and like have some drinks and like, you know.
Every time we play tested it, it was more fun with drinks.
Yes.
For sure. and funny voices.
Yes, exactly.
That's really interesting about the playtesting element of the game. And I did wonder about the rulebook includes lots of different variations for ways to play. And I wondered, did that come about through playtesting, or what was the inspiration behind all these different ways to play? There's one mode called dismissing gentlemen left and right, where players can discard unwanted suitors for extra points on proposal rolls. So yeah, where did these ideas kind of come from for different ways to play?
Sure. So it's an interesting, it's definitely a light strategy game. There's quite a bit of luck involved with this game, especially in the last stage of the game, the proposal stage. So for those people who aren't familiar with the game is run in two stages. The first stage of the game, each of the single ladies are sort of building up their character and acquiring points. And if they acquire points in different areas, they might try to catch the eye of one of the available suitors. And all of the characters are from Pride and Prejudice. And so each of these, so you're collecting points in the first stage, and then in the second stage, that's a proposal stage. So hopefully a suitor will ask you to...
Yeah, hopefully you do enough to draw their eye. And catch their attention, and they'll say, oh, perhaps this one.
Yeah. But the thing that I think a lot of more strategically minded gamers don't like about the game is that last stage is very luck based, and that's very intentional on my part, is that the women in the game do not have the power to propose to a man. Only the man has power to propose to the women in this world. And so that is why you roll the dice to see if you actually get a proposal. And then the way the math works out is if you turn down somebody early in the proposal stage, hoping you might get a proposal later on, that's completely borrowed from Pride and Prejudice. So if you turn down Mr. Collins, maybe Mr. Darcy will propose, but you don't know. You're really taking a chance. You could lose the game if you turn down somebody less suitable early, it's risky. And so that mechanic is entirely, that's the book. So that's all built from the book. So some of those rule variations, getting back to your question, are to sort of mitigate some of that risk for those players who are a little bit more strategically minded. So if you're the type of gamer that is really interested in like the math and a little bit more of the crunchiness of how to optimize this, one of those rule variations might be more your cup of tea, I would say.
Or if you really just like the title and you want to be able to marry Mr. Darcy no matter who you're playing as, there's a variation for that too.
Yeah.
To illustrate your point about the how even if you tick all the boxes as a player, so you could be the most accomplished player, you could fulfill all the requirements, and still at the proposal stage end up as the old maid with no proposals. And yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about the old maid card in a minute because it's such an interesting kind of concept for gameplay. But yeah, you can kind of tick all the boxes and still end up not winning the game. So that luck element, I think, makes it so interesting and a different game each time you play. So yeah, it's great. Actually, I think we'll talk about the old maid card now because it's kind of come up in conversation. This is an option for those who don't know during the marriage proposal stage of the game for players who have been unsuccessful in their proposals, or for some players, it's actually a strategic choice during gameplay. So what led you to include this as an option in the game?
Yeah, I was thinking about, first of all, there's the experience of the player, right? So if you've spent, an hour or so playing this game, building up your character, and then all of a sudden you get no proposals, I think you still want a chance to win. And that even though I think your chances really are lower, I think there's something to like the experience and having like some sort of final fate, some closure to your experience of playing the game. And I think there's also, in Jane Austen's world, there are the spinster characters. Like those are characters in her world that never.
Charlotte, starting almost with Charlotte.
Yeah.
Like that's almost Charlotte's fate. And so having something that reflects that, I think, is smart. But do you want to talk about Jane Austen herself?
Yeah. So Jane Austen was never married, and she
lived with her brother?
Her brother, I think. Yes. So, so I think I made that maybe the top, like if you roll to see what your fate is as an old maid, because again, it can be really, yeah, I think the way it's portrayed in the book, and based on, I did research this at the time, it's hard to like think back to that, like what happened to these women. So like Jane Austen lived with her brother and lived a pretty comfortable life. So if you roll a 6 out on a 6-sided die, like that's sort of your fate. But then as you roll lower, it's less appealing, and you get less points for those particular.
You can win the game with the old maid card. I mean, you essentially have to become as famous as Jane Austen in order to do so.
Yeah.
But you can do it, and people will tweet about it from time to time.
Yeah. And there is a card in the event deck where, and this I think was a little bit my modern lens of like, you shouldn't have to get married. Like I couldn't help like stick a little bit of that in there just because, I just couldn't help it. So there's a card in the event deck that if you choose to, you can say, well, forget about all these guys. I don't care about that. I'm going for pure points. And then you can sort of like go that direction. So you have that sort of option that you're choosing to not do that. And it gives you a point bonus if you decide to do that. And it's, again, it's a little bit risky, but you can, if you have a good dice roll and you're really focused on collecting points and taking points from other people, you can make that work.
One of the things that I really love about the game is the event cards that kind of you pick at random throughout the game. They range from attending a ball to a sister's scandalous elopement. How did you go about creating or choosing these events for gameplay?
I read the book several times. And I also, man, I know that 1995 BBC adaptation by heart. So in the book, I went through, I remember parties being a big, I sort of thought of the kinds of events that were happening in gatherings, and parties were a big one. I think every party that happens in the book I have in the game. And I read those scenes and tried to have those characters there. There might be a little bit of fudging in there because of just game
to make
mechanics.
It generalized or something.
Yeah. But yeah, I parties were such a big part of, like, when people got together, so many pivotal plot points. Just looking at the story, and then what are the big things that happen. So scandals are, like, that's a big thing that happens. Surprise proposals are another things. Like, Elizabeth gets 3 proposals in the book. She gets Mr. Collins. She gets the first one from Mr. Darcy, which she turns down, and then the second one from Mr. Darcy. So I think Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy both have early proposal cards. So sort of looking at the big plot points of the book and trying to think mechanically how those would like what that means in terms of gameplay. So for example, an early proposal from Mr. Darcy, you can accept it, and then you don't have to worry about the proposal stage. So that has some advantages, but your point total is lower, because I imagine that if Elizabeth really had conceded, that she wouldn't have been as happy with herself and her, and so it's worth less points, happiness points, or however you want to count it. So yeah, that's just looking at the book and what the major events were. And then there's a couple in there that are just funny. There were a couple of cards that we just found some really amazing artwork. There's a woman with a very low cut bodice that I'm like, oh, that looks like a great scandal card. So we maybe added a little extra flavor in there.
We spiced it up a little bit.
So yeah.
That actually brings us on to kind of some questions about the design of the game itself. And there are some really wonderful illustrations and some character designs that you kind of mentioned already. And I was wondering, were there any specific historical objects, sources, or films depicting the Regent's era that inspired the artwork for the game?
Well, so there's custom art that I put together that I illustrated myself. And then a lot of the artwork on event cards is sourced from the Graphics Fairy, which we collaborated with a little bit. And those are, all public domain images. They're from, C.E. Brock's illustrations and some of the more well-known, work from the golden age of British illustration. So interestingly, a lot of those were produced in the late 1800s, I believe, and so they're not really appropriate to the time frame, and some of them look a little bit more Victorian than they do Regency. But we decided that 90% of the time no one would care. Yeah, so as for what might have influenced the art in terms of character design and stuff, we definitely pulled from here and there. I wanted to make each character sort of stand alone as a unique interpretation, but there's some things a lot of the hairstyles, like on the gentlemen, are like the Regency era hairstyles. That was when I think for men we started putting product in our hair, and we grew out our sideburns. There was like a really specific look, thanks to the Prince Regent's concern about his like double chin and the high collars and all that. So there's kind of like a consistent look for the men, and so I think like I needed to make Mr. Darcy look like Mr. Darcy. I don't believe I did. I don't believe I made him look like Colin Firth too much, but he definitely has some of the same attributes as Colin Firth's version of Mr. Darcy. Um, and I think Elizabeth has a few of the same attributes as Jennifer Ely's portrayal as well. But that's, I think, because most fandom, for them, it's their like prime version. Like they both have dark hair. I could have made a blonde Elizabeth, but I don't think that is that even book appropriate. I can't remember.
I can't remember. I can't remember at this point, but I always picture her with dark hair, so I'm sure I would have been like, she's brunette.
Right. Yeah. And then many of the other characters were kind of, they might have been influenced by another version, or like I think Caroline Bingley was one of those, right? Like I think in, like, for example, in the BBC version, I'm pretty sure that actor has also dark curly hair like Elizabeth, and it doesn't work well when you have to look quickly at the two cards. So I think I made her very blonde, and that meant making Bingley blonde as well, like to make them look like siblings. And so a lot of choices were made that way, just to kind of make sure people looked like Georgiana Darcy and Fitzwilliam Darcy look. I tried to make them look like siblings, and which you can't do with a film as much, because you're just casting actors rather than choosing facial features. So I tried to give consistency to a lot of those things. The Bennett sisters are all fairly similar to one another, I think, in terms of hair color and general look, but they have different traits that might be unique to each other. Does that cover it all?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay,
I was thinking about what you said about the illustrations actually being from a slightly later period, and it kind of made me think about how a lot of games have to kind of use visual aspects to kind of bring out the history in how a game looks, and particularly the use of silhouettes that's on a lot of the cards, and how that adds this sense of kind of a historical sense to the game, and helps players kind of realize that element and be reminded of that element. So yeah, it's a really effective kind of two different styles in the aesthetics.
I did make a deliberate visual choice that I think a lot of Jane Austen stuff looks very, I mean, we have so much surviving graphic design work, or what would now be called graphic design work, from the Victorian period. And I think Regency period is a lot less interesting, just because the printing technology was less interesting. And so it can look very, to modernize, it can look maybe a little more boring. And so I think the playing cards wouldn't have been brightly colored. The typography would have been very specific, and I think a lot of Jane Austen materials will use, like, there is a Jane Austen font based on her handwriting, and so we kind of deliberately avoided that and used more typography that was a little bit later in the 1800s, and that was all pretty deliberate, just to give it a little more of a modern edge, just to kind of juice it a bit, because we wanted it to feel I don't know. I think I wanted it to sell. We wanted it to appeal to a contemporary audience, and also as a man and a non Jane Austen. I don't know. I sort of half read Pride and Prejudice in high school, and couldn't handle it. I was like 16 or 17, and it was too much for me at the time. Too much of a tome. And so I thought it needed to appeal to people with that sensibility too. Like, if you want to convince someone to play it with you, it's got to have a little bit of snap to it too. So we tried to throw some of that in there too. So it's got some contemporary edge to it, and a little bit of not exactly historical typographic choices and things, but just enough, I think.
That's interesting, because I was actually thinking about the demographic for this game, right? Because it feels like you have the board game audience that would be interested in like strategy and wargaming and all of this, like, mathematical, all of this geeky, nerdy stuff. And then you have Pride and Prejudice. It's a different kind of demographic. It's a different kind of like person that I feel like would be interested in both of these things. How do you feel like you've blended these two interests together, of like both being interested in literature and Pride and Prejudice, and also be interested in board games, because they don't really often meet? I don't think there's a lot of like high profile board games based on literature?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that we're continually surprised by is how wide the audience for this game actually is. And that is not something that we anticipated or planned for. So
Right.
when I made the game, I really just made it for me. And, I thought there might be the goal with we crowdfunded this through Kickstarter, and the goal was, I think when I had done all this research about making it and printing it, the goal was to print 500 copies. And I thought that, man, if we could do that, that would be huge. Wouldn't that, it will exist as a thing. And so there was, there's always the dream that it's going to sell, but I thought the reality would be that this is going to be just this little niche, and it really still is. Like let's not, don't want to be too big for my britches. This is it's still a pretty indie game. But we wanted it. I thought it was just going to be for me. And then the Kickstarter sort of took off, and we were able to print a lot more copies. I think the first print run was more like 3,000 copies.
Mm-hmm.
And now, 7-8 years later, we're over 50,000 copies sold. So I'm honestly surprised that the audience is wider. At game conventions, when we go, a lot of times we'll have I'll have a lot of men come up to me and say that they bought it for their spouse or their wife, who's a huge fan. But I have lots of I think it has a wide enough appeal that there's just enough strategy for the gamers
to go along with it,
Yeah, but there's also enough narrative that appeals to people who want that sort of story-based element. So I think it's a pretty good blending of those two kinds of ways that we play games.
Yeah, we kind of stumbled into being a crossover nerd experience, but
crossover nerd. Yeah.
But that's kind of what it ended up being with.
Since the release of the game, there's been 2 expansion packs. There's one based on Austen's book 𝐸𝐬, and the other entitled Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. How has the game developed in these 2 expansion packs?
Sure. So 𝐸𝐬 was developed. I had an expansion in me, and so I picked another book that I enjoyed, and so I picked 𝐸𝐬. And I think I had looked at other books. 𝐸𝐬 seemed like it would be, with the number of characters that were in that book, like that was a pretty easy one to adapt, just because it had quite a few women and men, and like the number of characters that we had.
And it's about matchmaking.
And it's about matchmaking and all that stuff. It seemed like it was going to translate pretty well. So when you get the expansion, you get all of those new characters, and then you also get a new event deck. And so I read the book. I watched a bunch of 𝐸𝐬 adaptations to kind of, sometimes seeing like the adaptations helps me like boil down, because they have to make so many judicious cuts when they make a film adaptation. It helps you see the sort of what the most important plot points are, that they're like, this has to be in. And so you kind of, it helped me sort of see what that was in the book. And then I wrote a new event deck, and I sort of mechanically made it similar to Marrying Mr. Darcy, but there's still Gambit cards. I think those cards are still in there. There's still parties, but they're based on the parties in the other book. And then whatever other sort of like scenes there were and like plot points, I tried to put those into that event deck. So it's more 𝐸𝐬's journey through her story and the things that happen in that story. And the other one, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I think the other one that was wasn't that a reward tier for the Kickstarter?
Yeah, the other one,
It was almost a joke.
It was almost a joke. I mean, I really enjoy Pride and Prejudice and zombies, and
and there were a couple of other. There's like a couple vampire ones out there too,
Mhm.
like Pride and Prejudice with vampires, or I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a few of these paranormal kind of like mashups. And,
yeah.
yeah.
So I enjoyed reading that book and
And the film.
And the film. I enjoyed the film. It was I know not everybody liked the film, but I thought it was a pretty fun ride. So and I think another sort of trope for board games, honestly, is like, let's do a zombie expansion. So I mean,
It was ready to go.
It was ready to go. So the undead expansion is that expansion is very different from the Emma expansion. The Emma is like based on the book Emma, but the zombie expansion you can shuffle into either of those event decks, and then there's like the additional storytelling of not only are you in Jane Austen's worlds, but there's also zombies you have to worry about and these curses that happen.
So you
and
can get some weapons.
Yeah, you can get a cricket bat and start, going to town, swinging that around. And I just thought it's definitely pretty silly. But if if you're hanging out with friends and having some drinks and you just want something ridiculous to do, you can shuffle that into the deck, and it sort of adds another dimension to it that is.
I don't believe it follows any of the plot beats of any of those adaptations where they inserted paranormal elements. I think we just kind of sat down and said, "Wouldn't this be hilarious?"
Yeah.
Put it together.
I was actually thinking that in terms of like copyright and in terms of like actually following the beats, because obviously Emma and Pride and Prejudice are adaptable, but Pride and Prejudice and zombies would probably not be. So I was thinking,
Correct, yeah.
I was thinking even about like how I was thinking maybe you actually secured the rights and this is an official like expansion.
Oh no! I mean, it's worth pointing out it's called the Undead Expansion.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean it's generalized and
yeah. So I mean, and there's no, besides the fact that there are undead in the world, like that's the thing that was borrowed, and I thought. I think we thought that was general enough that we could as conceptually that would be okay to borrow. And then the artwork that Erik found for that, he found some really cool skeletons and that kind of thing. So that's how they're visually represented
they're
in the cards.
Walking skeletons.
And so I think just the idea that there's undead and you need to fight them off is kind of what we borrowed, but nothing specific from that property.
No, nothing.
Because I'm thinking, even as you said, like zombies is such a famous trope in video games and board games, just gaming in general. Throw zombies in it, it'll be fine, and just fodder.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
That's exactly right.
I love this idea that you bring this in and into this context. Okay, so let's move on from game design to distributing and publishing. This is something I'm curious about. So in addition to being the creators and illustrators, respectively, you have both co-produced Marrying Mr. Darcy. What were some of the challenges of the production? Did you run into any surprises?
We were talking about this.
Yeah, we were trying to remember ahead of time.
Yeah. Honestly, Erik is such a professional. He has done so many projects of this scope, producing his own graphic novels. And he's just a professional. So he really knew how to make this happen.
I used to be a publication designer before I became an academic. And so, sending files to printers is something I did pretty much every week. So I kind of knew how to prepare things appropriately and how to talk to printers. And when they had questions for us about things, I just kind of took care of that end of it, I guess. So I don't think we ran into any snags. It was just like a book or any other book or magazine, just without the binding.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that helped us was we had both just finished graduate degrees fairly recently. And you go through grad school and you sort of think, oh, I can just research whatever and I'll figure it out. Like I can solve a lot of problems by doing research. And that proved to be the case. Is I learned a lot about getting quotes and like how much things costs and researching different printers that we could send it to. And I mean, just doing the groundwork of learning how to do that, and between that and I think Erik's prior experience, we just sort of figured it out. And it I think we also worked with some really great people that helped us along the way. And we managed to get it all done. I think actually just the making of the thing, like, and finishing it was maybe the hardest thing, like making sure it got done. But Erik is
I didn't think.
Well, I think I have to give Erik a lot of credit. I made this game sort of starting just for me, and then he started drawing some art for when we were going to publish it, and I thought, oh, now I really have to finish. He's doing work now too. So that really put the pressure on me to make sure that the mechanics and all the authorship were, like, all the writing was done.
Well, yeah, I think we wanted to play test it, and so I started drawing the character art just as line art, not even as anything in color. I think I didn't know that at the time, but that's kind of what lit a fire under Erika to keep going.
That's super interesting. So then it wasn't necessarily important that it was self-published. We speak with board game designers and creators sometimes about like, oh, this is my project, this is my kind of baby, if you will, and it's difficult to have someone else be in charge of it. So it wasn't necessarily important that it is self-published. It just happened.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because so at the time, I'm not a game designer. I'm a musician. Nobody knows who I am in the game design world. Probably nobody still really.
Like 10 or 12 people know who I am in the comics world.
Right. And I'm a concert band conductor. So I have zero cred. In game design. And also, who's going to publish a game about Pride and Prejudice? Like, what publisher is going to pick that
up? Who's going to touch that with a 10-foot pole or whatever?
And I couldn't, I did do some research about different publishers, but especially, I don't know, so that would have been 9 years ago now. And I couldn't see anybody taking a chance on something so niche. Yeah. And so
a few years prior to that, I had published self-published a graphic novel about the Norse myths. It's called Gods of Asgard. If there's anyone out there who knows my name, it's probably because of that. And it's just it's an adaptation of the Norse myths in English. It's the first graphic novel of that kind. And it came out in 2007, 3 years before the Thor movie and like 5 years before the Vikings TV series. And so today you would say, well, of course someone's going to publish that. Neil Gaiman's writing a version, like writing that. Like, of course, people are going to publish that. Everyone loves Viking stuff. But in the mid 2000s, no one cared about Viking stuff at all. It was incredibly niche. And I got this like grant, this indie grant for indie people to basically self-publish it, because it was the kind of project that a publisher probably wouldn't touch, because they'd say, well, I mean, who's really into this? Only like a few select history nerds and mythology nerds. And so I think we felt it was very similar to that, in that like, well, there's going to be some librarians and some like book nerds who are into this, but I mean, is it going to move our profit margin or whatever? So I don't think we didn't even submit anywhere or anything.
I didn't submit it anywhere. It seemed like a waste of my time. And also, Erik, having run a successful Kickstarter for his graphic novel, Beast of Wolf's Bay, I thought this feels like the path that makes this project accomplishable. So we really focused on that. And we have had some interest of publishers. Occasionally, somebody will contact me about maybe picking it up. And at this point, I'm sort of like, nah, I think I'm going to hang on to this. So, but it's I don't know, it's an interesting it's an interesting problem whether you sort of want to hang on to that work yourself or you want to let that go and let somebody else develop it. So it's definitely still something we're interested in, but at this point the game is still self-published.
It's interesting that you say this, because I'm thinking Kickstarter is also kind of giving everyone kind of access to how the game will look like. Obviously, because they vote with their wallets and because the stretch goals, get achieved and, get unlocked and that thing. So how is, just in general, your relationship with like Kickstarter, your relation with your backers? What can you tell us about like how that process went from we're thinking about 500 copies to like now we're being backed, we see, a tremendous amount of success on Kickstarter. How was that relationship?
I think it was great. I mean, it really allowed us to raise money and to sort of find our audience and supporters. I had some social media happening at the time, Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and a few other platforms at that time. But a lot of the backers were just people who were on Kickstarter and looking for games. And so we gained a lot of audience. So that was huge, way more than I think we anticipated.
We didn't set up a game studio or anything like that. We didn't cultivate a list of prospective backers or anything like that. It was basically just like, hey, friends, here's a thing we've been doing for 2 summers.
Yeah.
Come check it out.
So we had some social media presence, but yeah, it was a lot. It was, we kind of threw it up there and it sort of, it took off. And so we benefited from Kickstarter's the reason that it exists. So it really worked to our benefit.
We were surprised too.
Yeah.
I mean, we thought it would fund, but we were surprised that it did really well.
Yeah.
Or as well as it did.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting that. We still at the time thought it was very niche.
Yeah.
Obviously, even Kickstarter has kind of grown in the years, and in terms of popularity, do you think organic reach or organic growth like this would be possible today? Or like, better yet, what kind of advice would you have? Like, let's say you were to start Pride and Prejudice, marrying Mr. Darcy today. What advice would you give yourselves, or what advice would you give, the public at large, being like, okay, it's 2021, Kickstarter is in a way different position, kind of a reputation?
It's a very interesting question. I'm working on a project at the moment, which I'll probably announce in a few moments. And I'm working with a friend of mine from the university I work at. And we're planning a Kickstarter launch July 6th, I believe. And, he and I talk about the Kickstarter campaign a lot, but he is putting a ton more energy into it than we ever did, than I ever did. Because, 8 years ago or 10 years ago or it really has changed. And I think, so even when we had Marrying Mr. Darcy 8 years ago, is that right?
That sounds about right.
I think the wind was already changing direction a little bit, because we were an independent, just, a married couple putting out a project. And that's how we saw Kickstarter at the time, was like, this is for people who have like a wild idea or like a pet project and they can raise funds and get it out there. But I think even in that year, we were getting comments and feedback from people who would ask questions about, well, who's the CEO of your studio or something? And I think like the projects that are coming out now are a lot more, I don't want to say developed, but the business development, I guess, is a lot more intense and deep. And you can still put out a truly indie game or project, but it's almost harder to cut through the noise of all of the really major projects that are coming out that way. So in terms of advising, I don't know, because we've given, I mean, my friend Dave, like I'm working on that with him. Erika chimes in often about Kickstarter advice. And then, once in a while we'll say something and he'll be like, oh yeah, well, the times have changed. You guys were in the Wild West days of Kickstarter.
Yeah. I mean, I just filmed my intro video on my phone.
Yep.
and like in my dining room and did my own voiceover and my own video editing. I did it all. It was DIY, and I didn't spend a dime. I didn't spend any money because I didn't know that this thing was going to fund. And
no
so
animation, no professional voice actors,
none of that stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I'd like to think that the idea of the game is still like solid enough that it would still find its place. But you never know. I don't know. Who knows if it would have cut through the noise at that point at today.
Yeah, it's a gnarly problem to kind of try and solve today. And yeah, let's move into the final portion of the podcast, and then two of my last questions would be, what are you trying to achieve with or in your games beyond having fun? Is there an educational purpose? Is there like a purpose to maybe draw like, hey, like Pride and Prejudice is an excellent book and maybe you should read it? What is kind of the, perhaps beyond having fun, the secondary purpose or purposes of a game like Marrying Mr. Darcy?
I definitely had in mind that there could be some educational benefit to the game, and there was a little part of me that imagined this being played in high school English, British literature sort of classes, especially to maybe as either as a discussion point, or that to talk about like the society and what that meant at that time, because the mechanics, I think, illustrate some of those concepts fairly well.
Yeah, the idea of marriage as a really economic system rather than like a love system, or social climbing. I don't know.
That whole concept. And I thought also the fact that it's a game might make it appealing to people like my husband, who when they were 17 and in high school, and that just wasn't their thing, maybe this would have helped them understand it a little bit more, rather than going through what can be a rather intimidating book if that's not what you're interested in. So I think it also...
I want to point out that I was a pretty academically minded student.
But yeah, it's definitely, it's not everyone's cup of tea. So it also could be a little bit of an introduction to the book for some folks. I think there's a little bit of... I enjoy the fact that you can only play as one of the female characters. That was a decision I made very early on, and I enjoy that you're forced to do that, like that you have to play one of the women characters, and I think that's not the case in a lot of board games, especially that came out more like 10 years ago. Like the idea of gender, of all representation in gaming is huge, but especially for this particular game, gender representation, and the fact that that you're playing as not as the people in power. That doesn't really make any sense. You're playing as the people that are not in power in this society and world. So I also sort of enjoy that, but it's also very tongue-in-cheek and has like a modern spin. A lot of these ideas, I think I try to I'm hope that there is humor in the game, so that with our modern lens, we can see that this sort of how removed, in some ways, how removed we are from this, and this idea of gender roles and marriage and that sort of thing, that we're sort of through our modern lens, sort of seeing the ridiculousness of that dynamic, if that kind of makes sense. So there's definitely a sort of a humorous spin on that's possible because we have this modern lens to look through.
Which I think is very true to how Jane Austen wrote it too. But I think putting a contemporary spin on it helps highlight a lot of those elements.
Yeah, interesting. For listeners and watchers, what games like Marrying Mr. Darcy would you recommend, or like, do you incorporate like playing board games or just games in general in your lives? Are there any games in particular you would recommend to us?
Oh, I have a recommendation, but
I'll start since his recommendation is really a plug. So I've really been enjoying, especially as we are, rounding the year mark on the pandemic. I have really been enjoying role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Basically being able to play remotely. We had a couple of games going this year, and man, it's so appealing to be able to, create a world where you can sort of control a lot of things that aren't necessarily in our control right now. I think emotionally had a lot of appeal to me. So I've been playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons lately, and different RPGs. So that's sort of what I've been doing recently.
Also, we couldn't get together and play board
Yeah,
games
it's
with
been a
anybody, so-
challenging year for that. So I think that sort of has been scratching the itch for me most recently.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I should recommend, I would be remiss if I did not recommend the upcoming board game Distilled, which is about distilling spirits and was conceived in your home of Edinburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And if that tickles anyone's fancy, it's you can find out more at distilledgame.com. The Kickstarter will launch July 6th.
And we will have a link to this in the show notes again for anyone interested in finding more. And we'll probably tweet about it and retweet it when the time comes. Thank you so much to both of you. Where could our listeners find more about you, Erik and Erik? Are you on social media? Would you like to plug that?
Sure. If you're interested in learning more about Marrying Mr. Darcy, you can find that at marryingmrdarcy.com.
Marrying Mr. Darcy.
Yeah. Marrying Mr. Darcy. Yes, exactly. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about me, you can find me at erikasvanoe.com. And that's more if there's any like crossover listeners in the band world, like I hope you'll check out my music. It's the other part of my creative life. So yeah.
The other part.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm all over the internet. If you search for Erik Evensen, but mainly I live at 𝐓𝐸𝐬𝐴vensen.com. That's hyphen, the hyphen, not the word hyphen. Erik-Evensen.com. And then I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. You can find links to those from my website, either 𝐸𝐸vensen or 𝐂𝐸𝐸vensen usually on things.
Oh, perfect. And I'll be linking to both of your websites in that sense for our listeners and watchers to check out. What would you like to emphasize? If there's one thing for like anyone listening and watching, if you would like to emphasize, what is it? What is the one thing from both of you that, it would end the show? What would that one thing be?
I would say, if you have an idea that you are passionate about, you should just make that thing. If there's an idea you have to make something, you should just make it, because you never know how it'll take off, but it'll bring you personal joy. And I think in our lives, as both as a couple and individually,
as artists,
in different veins, that's how we enjoy living our lives, and I think it brings a lot of satisfaction. So if you have an idea, just go for it and make it.
Yeah, I tell students this all the time, because when you're 20 years old, let's say, you see so many barriers to producing a thing that you want to see, or you say like, well, I couldn't write a graphic novel, I don't know how to write, or I couldn't make a board game, I don't know how to make art or something. And really, like, none of that should stop you. You should still make it, because the only way to really learn these things is to do it.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful advice, and I'm sure like people, our age would appreciate the kind of advice that just like spur you on. Just do the thing. I think many of us have like pet projects, passion projects, and it's good to see game designers as yourselves be like, no, just do it. Don't worry about it. Just do it.
Just make the thing.
Just make the thing. Thank you so much, Erika and Erik. Thank you to Hannah for co-hosting, co-moderating this podcast to me. In terms of more products, more from the History and Games Lab podcast, we recently had a talk on presenting your research through games by our friends and fellow lab colleagues 𝐵𝐸sepPe 𝐭 𝐒𝐿𝐿𝐼𝐻, Francesca Migliazzo, and Jacob Morley. The recording of the talk is available on the YouTube channel, which is where hopefully you're watching this if you're watching, and you'll find a link to it in the description for this podcast. In terms of if you have any feedback or you would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance, our DMs are open on Twitter at @HNGLab, or you can email us at hngLabpodcast@gmail.com. For more on the History and Games Lab, please access our Linktree link. Again, all of these links from the History and Games Lab, from Eric, from Erika, are going to be available in the show notes, so please do check those out. Join us later in the month for the next episode of the podcast. In addition to this one, we will have one more episode of the podcast that will air this May. As seems kind of to be a tradition that we have with the podcast. We're not yet sure about the topic, about the guests, but rest assured, we will be looking forward to getting guests as exciting as this episode had been. And thank you so much for your patience with us as we navigate the world of podcast scheduling and production and recording. And once again, thank you so much to Erika, Erik, and to Hannah for joining me. Thank you so much. The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab, which should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.